Latter-day Peace Studies is produced by peace-loving members of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Any views expressed herein are not to be taken as official positions of the Church or its authorities.
Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. I'm Christopher Hurtado.
And I'm Ben Peterson.
Thank you for joining us as we discuss this week's reading of Come Follow Me as outlined by The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Our hope is that as we discuss the Scriptures, we will come to a more perfect understanding through experiencing the atonement of Jesus Christ and find greater peace in our lives.
Welcome back to Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. I'm your co-host, Ben Peterson.
And I'm your co-host, Christopher Hurtado. It's good to be with you, Ben.
Yeah, good to be with you, Christopher. Today we're going to be discussing the letter of James. This is probably not a letter. You know, it's interesting. This kind of thing has come up previously. We talked about how Hebrews wasn't really an epistle, although we call it an epistle. And this letter of James appears to be, you know, maybe it was drafted later as a letter, but the content of this seemed to be more like a collection of sayings or what we might call proverbs. And so this by some is considered the Proverbs of the New Testament, so to speak, right?
Yeah, you know, it's funny because I remember, didn't Hebrews have the ending of a letter and this has the beginning of a letter? But
right.
Neither one of them has a beginning and ending of a letter?
Yeah, and so this seems to have been maybe turned into a letter at some point.
Maybe.
Yeah, so there's three different ways that people have looked at this. One is to say this was written by James, the brother of Jesus. Now, this James is not James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee, James, right? And I think that is sometimes confused people. This James would be the brother of Jesus. That is, it's attributed to him, but there's nothing in the text that says that it's him, right? It just says James. And so there could be lots of people named James.
Yeah, and that's, of course, Jacob, right? We say
Yes.
James, but it's Yaakov, right? Another thing, Ben, is, you know, you said it's like the New Testament Proverbs, right? I'm saying that, but you said it's like Proverbs. I'm calling it the Proverbs of the New Testament. But that wasn't my first impression. My first impression was this is like the Gospel of Thomas. But then I realized the Gospel of Thomas says Jesus said something. And, you know, these are sayings of Jesus. Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said, right? Whereas this is I say, I say, I say. And that's why it's like Proverbs, because it's Solomon saying things.
Yeah, there is a sense here that there is some sayings stuff going on. So I can definitely see how it can feel a little more Gospel of Thomas in that sense. This might be a collection of sayings of James, right? That then somebody put together and made it look like a letter in the tradition of the letters. And that would probably place it after Paul's letters at some point, right? So you've got this tradition of letter writing, and then you have a community that ascribes to the teachings of James in particular, and they, at some later date, may have compiled those teachings in a way and made a letter out of it. That's one way of viewing this, that it's not necessarily James writing it, but that it is maybe reflects James's views and his sayings, but then it's compiled at a later time.
Another idea, Ben, is that if this is by the brother of Jesus, Jacob, right, whom we call James, then he's the head of the church at Jerusalem. And he is the head of this, what I've been calling on the podcast, the Jacobite Christianity, right? Up against which Paul goes. You know, at first we have Paul, and there are different versions of what Paul does. There was one from Acts and one from Paul. And in the Acts version, Paul goes straight after his road to Damascus experience, he goes straight to Jacob, right, to get permission to do what he does. And he's given permission to go preach to the Gentiles. James is more concerned with the Jews, right? In Paul's own version, though, it's a couple of years or something, right? Before he goes, he's doing his thing. He doesn't need permission. As a matter of fact, he compares himself to Moses. He tells us, even if an angel says otherwise, we should listen to Paul, not the angel, because even an angel isn't like Paul, because Paul got it straight from the horse's mouth, right? He had Jesus himself appear to him on the road to Damascus.
And I got a sense reading this that if we're talking about something that is representing a view that was held by the historical James, brother of Jesus, which isn't really, we can't say with certainty, right? We don't have any other writings of James to really compare this to, but this is how it's been attributed. But in any case, if we're saying that, then there is a difference in the approach that we're seeing here. Paul is presenting his gospel, his view of God as he has received revealed by a vision of Jesus, right? Paul isn't one who walked and talked with Jesus during his mortal life. But Paul is presenting his version as authoritative because he got it from a resurrected Jesus, a heavenly Jesus. And it seems to me that might be contrasted or juxtaposed against a presentation we have from James that isn't necessarily outright, like you said, Christopher, quoting Jesus. It's not saying, hey, Jesus said this, and then giving some sort of exposition of that. But it does seem to be a little more of a presentation of Jesus, or of the gospel, if you will, that is more concerned with specifically the ethics of your life, like how you're treating others, and less concerned with the presentation of a resurrected Jesus as something to believe in.
And what that means, right? The meaning of the death and resurrection of Jesus. I think you've pointed us to something that might be really helpful in reading this text, which is we could say that Paul is telling us about a heavenly Jesus, and James is telling us about an earthly Jesus.
Yeah, it could be in that sense. And that was sort of the way that I was thinking about it. When I go to the text of this letter, though, there's not a lot of reference to Jesus or the person of Jesus, right? It's not really referencing his life like the Gospels would.
True.
Now, you do get the name of Jesus throughout this, but as you were pointing out, Christopher, it's possible that the way that those are phrased, especially with the way that it titles Jesus, could potentially be some interpolations. And so it presents a lot of possibilities about what is the real perception of James. And again, you have to start with the premise that this is James to really go in that direction, right? But if you do, then you can start sort of thinking here, okay, James, brother of Jesus, if we take from the Gospels that he didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. As his brother, he didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, say the Gospels, until at least at his death or after the death of Jesus. And then James seems to come around, right, and be part of the community, and then even becomes a leader in the community. And so from a certain perspective, this James is less concerned with the person of Jesus and more concerned with the teachings of Jesus.
And that's a good way to put it. By the way, the Greek here is so excellent that it doesn't seem like it can come from a rural Galilean, right? That's another reason to think this really isn't James writing. But again, it is a collection of sayings, so it could be sayings of James put into writing by someone else.
Yeah, and that's a possibility. But yeah, like you said, that James wouldn't have known Greek to be able to write this way in Greek.
Not at this level. And speaking to your references to Jesus throughout the text, I would say 3 references aren't really throughout. I don't know if you meant because they're spread out a little bit, but they do look like potential interpolations. And there are a couple reasons to think that. One of them is really awkward compared to the Greek around it in terms of its the way it shows up. Another one doesn't have to be about Jesus. It can be understood in a Jewish context in a different way. And another one isn't really about Jesus at all, but could be understood as about Jesus, right? Meaning, I guess that's just like the previous one. It could go either way, right? There are only 3 references to Jesus. It's not really about Jesus.
Yeah. And that is one of the reasons that you get people like Luther, who, when he's translating the Bible and comes across James, he doesn't consider this letter or this book or whatever, right? Whatever it is, to be as authoritative as the others. In fact, he takes it and puts it sort of in an appendix at the end. And he does this along with Hebrews, the whole book of Hebrews, Jude, and the whole book of Revelation, right? And
which is telling, by the way, the Revelation.
It's telling
part.
because, it's telling in a couple ways, but I think primarily I bring it up to highlight, look, people as religiously authoritative, not necessarily in our tradition, but in the Protestant Christian tradition, as Luther, have not considered this book, along with others, as authoritative as the others. And I think what that tells us is that, there is some leeway here as we come to these scriptures, and we don't have to, as some might say, just consider everything inerrant and accept it whole cloth, right?
Well, it would be difficult to do that anyway, because the Bible is not univocal, right? It's full of contradictions. Yeah. There is something else about it, Ben. It seems like it's a response to Paul in some sense.
And it could be. Yeah. I mean, if we posit that this is, again, a collection of sayings of James, and it's sort of held by initially the community that was more closely followers of James and his perspective, and then maybe was later published or circulated, I should say, as a sort of response to Paul, there seem to be a couple statements in there that do seem like they are responses or maybe even rebuttals of Paul, although they could be interpreted differently, right? Christopher, in your commentary, it was saying one thing about how James views faith, and in my commentary, it said the opposite. I thought that was interesting.
Right. It could be that it's a response to Paul in the sense that this author has a different view of faith and works. Mm-hmm. And you and I than Paul, right? And you and I had a long discussion pre-show about whether or not the views are actually different. And we went back and forth a little bit, right? You could read it one way or the other.
We did.
But there is this idea that, again, that there's a Jacobite church and then there's a Pauline church, or rather, I should say Jacobite churches and Pauline churches. And this whole thing hasn't really come together as one yet. And so there are these different views. And of course, there are different audiences to take into account, right? We know that Paul's writing mainly to Gentiles, although he does also write to Jews. James, I don't think, is really writing to Gentiles. He's writing to Jews.
Right. Yeah, I think that's definitely the intention.
So you mentioned, Ben, that there are 3 ways that we could look at this, and you got through one of them. What are the other 2?
Yeah, well, I think the 2 were kind of wrapped up in that. One being that James actually wrote this, which I don't think is a defensible position, because first and foremost, James wouldn't have known Greek well enough to actually be the writer of this, right? And so the sort of pullback position from that is, okay, these are collections of sayings of James that then somebody who does know Greek either translated or curated in Greek and created this. That's my view. I think that's the way that it most likely happened. The third way to take it is this is just complete pseudepigrapha, right? It doesn't have anything to do with James at all. It's just somebody that is taking the name of James and putting it in there. Or maybe the author didn't really intend James, the brother of Jesus, at all. The author's name is just James, as it happens, right? Because it's not necessarily an uncommon name.
To add to what you said about the second view, right? If someone else is writing this because, as you said, James doesn't know Greek, I think you mean he doesn't know this high style, this high rhetorical style. Maybe he knows some Greek. You and I talked pre-show. Maybe he knows some Greek, right? The way, what was it you said? The way your wife knows Spanish.
Well, the way my wife knows Spanish. Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Meaning what exactly? Give me some. My wife is fluent in Spanish.
Meaning familiar with, some words in Spanish and has played with it a little bit here and there, but not enough to have a conversation, not enough to read it, not enough to write it, right?
Yeah, I think of a routine of Paul Rodriguez, the comedian Paul Rodriguez, who says, I moved to, I can't remember what he said, LA or California or the United States, but regardless of which one it is. So I had to, learn the language, so I learned Spanish. right? Because it's something that's part of our milieu. So it would have been, Greek would have been part of, James's milieu, but it's not his language. And it's certainly not, someone who's this rural Galilean doesn't have this high style of Greek rhetoric.
Right. Now, one of the other considerations here is that we get a particular portrayal of Paul and James in the book of Acts. And as we've gone through the letters of Paul, you and I, Christopher, have kind of both come to the conclusion that the portrayal of Paul in Acts is probably not very historical, right? This is a way of presenting a certain perspective, and the author of Acts has certain purposes and goals in mind, and they portray Paul in a certain way that fits the narrative. Now, it's not necessarily like, wrong about who Paul was, but it doesn't, the character and even some of the historical details of Acts don't match up with what we find in the genuine letters of Paul. So we can kind of see that it's not a historical portrayal of him. What that brings up is, okay, then the author may not be presenting the character of James in a historical way either. So we get this portrayal of James in the book of Acts that is in some ways opposed to Paul, but then there's this reconciliation, right, between them, and they agree on certain things. And so if we take that portrayal of James and we try to sort of superimpose it on this letter of James, it may or may not really fit, because again, if these are the sayings of James, then that this is maybe something that is closer to a historical perspective. The author of the book of Acts may be distant from that, right?
I think I have something helpful, Ben. This, first of all, I've said in past episodes, right, that it could be that the book of Acts is in some sense a cleanup, meaning there is this Jacobite Christianity early on. There is this then Pauline Christianity. The two have to come together, and the book of Acts is giving us this unification. I'm calling it a cleanup, right? We could call it a unification, a narrative that sort of brings them back together. And here's what might be helpful. Our missionaries, right? LDS missionaries have been taught to go out and look for commonalities when they talk to people and not focus on the differences. So when we say that Acts is giving a portrayal of Paul, and a portrayal, therefore, potentially also of James, that isn't necessarily historical, I would say it's just not complete, right? A portrayal is, I remember in pre-show discussion, Ben, you were using the word caricature. I thought that was it had sort of negative connotations, right? Yeah, so it was a little heavy-handed, sure. And we talked about it, and we said, okay, portrayal then, right? The idea is we're going to focus on, right, as an author of Acts or authors of Acts, we're going to focus on what's the same and ignore what's different. But here you have some differences coming out. In fact, part of what could make this a response to Paul is that because Paul was teaching that it's not about Torah, right? When he teaches about faith versus works, it may have given some Jews this sense that, they could just abandon Torah. But Paul never said that, right? He was just saying that those who weren't Jews, the Gentiles, don't have to add Torah practices to their lives, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that those who were Jews should abandon them. But he did also teach that they are not really effectual, right? That Torah doesn't save you, right? That Torah never could get you close to God, right? Paul really goes all the way with that. He says it never was about Torah. And of course, again, a cleanup or a unification of all these ideas gives us the idea that, the Torah was to prepare us for Christianity. Right? Something like that. Mm-hmm. So it could be, that some Jews, and this may be James's concern, end up in what we can call antinomian practices, right? That they just are going to be lawless in some sense and do things that they're not supposed to do, that they take Paul. We can't blame this on Paul, but we can see how someone who hears about Paul's teachings could think, then that means I don't have to do X, Y, Z. And James is saying, no, wait a minute, let's not get carried away.
Yeah. And I think Paul kind of does say that in Romans. Like, his point is that if you are a Jew and this is part of your culture and where you come from and how you connect with your religion, you do need to keep doing those things. That is important for you to do those, because that's how you are sort of gauging yourself, right? But
Right.
don't focus on those as what's the important thing in and of themselves. Don't stop doing them, but remember that that's not the thing, right?
Right. And of course, that's discordant with the book of Hebrews. But then again, we've said the book of Hebrews isn't a letter from Paul. It's not even a letter at all. So if we look at book of Hebrews, then it really contradicts Paul. It was curious to me to read in the manual from the church that in some sense is saying, or could be interpreted as saying that what Hebrews is teaching is concordant with Paul. I don't think it is.
We saw plenty of contradictions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of course, when you and I say that, Ben, we're thinking of Paul, the undisputed Paul, right? Because I think if you lump in the pseudo-Pauline epistles, right, with Paul, then Hebrews may look more concordant with quote-unquote Paul, right? But not with the Paul that we see in the undisputed letters.
I think it makes it even more ambiguous, though. But yes, yeah. Now, another thing that might come up in a discussion about this book of James is that while we have Paul who talks about the law or the Torah isn't something that's important for Gentiles to observe, and while it may be important for the Jews, and then we see maybe in the book of Acts this portrayal of James as saying it's very important for the Jews to do X, Y, Z, particularly, right, the question comes down to circumcision. But then we also see statements about, what you can and can't eat, right? And so, but when we get here to this letter of James, there's no discussion of circumcision, right? It doesn't say anything about circumcision. There's no discussion about what you can and can't eat in particular. And so one might ask, and this kind of came up for me as I was reading through it, well, then how is this really James? Because if that's something that James was really interested in, he thought was important, then why isn't he saying that in this? And I think it's a good point, because if we posit this as sort of a response in any way to Paul, I would have expected something in this letter that addresses the question of circumcision or of, purity, what you can and can't eat. And there doesn't seem to be any sort of discussion there of those points. On the other hand, this does seem to be, the audience of this does seem to be ethnic Jews, right? People who are already within the context of that law, who are living that. And so it could be that there just isn't really a concern with addressing those questions. Maybe those questions are already settled in the community. And so we're really addressing something else, right? We're approaching something else. These would have been Jews that did believe Jesus was the Messiah within this community.
So to recap a little before we move on, again, this text is the least specifically focused text on Jesus in the New Testament, right? Mm-hmm. And that's, you could assume even that the references to the Lord Jesus Christ in 1:1, right, and 2:1 are Christian interpolations. Why? Because the first one is formulaic and the second one is rhetorically awkward. And even the coming of the Lord part in chapter 5, could refer to the day of the Lord, which is in the Jewish tradition. So that's all you've got is those three references that are either suspect or not necessarily about Jesus. And so it's just not about Jesus. And then you have this, it's presented as a letter, right? But it looks more like an ethical discourse. We've compared it to the Gospel of Thomas. We've compared it to Proverbs. It can also compare to Sirach, right? Wisdom of Sirach. So it looks like wisdom literature. And by the way, as pointed out on our sister podcast, Latter-day Contemplation presents Come Follow Me, giving Sufi exegesis. That's the way to read all these texts anyway, right? As wisdom literature. As my Sufi master and co-host says, I'll read a gum wrapper if I can find wisdom on it, right? Yeah. Or a candy bar or whatever, right? If there's wisdom, I mean, come on. I've read cereal boxes for wisdom, right? That happens depending on where you are, right? Sometimes, certainly as a boy and maybe even as an adult from time to time. So, and then finally, right, it has this epistolary opening in that looks like it's added to it, right? But it doesn't have a closing. And we said Hebrews was the other way around, right?
Yeah.
And one more thing, because it's not dealing with any specific community, it's categorized as a Catholic letter. And by Catholic, I don't mean the Roman Catholic Church. I mean universal. Catholic means universal. So the Catholic Church really just means the church with a capital T and capital C, right? So this is a Catholic letter in that it's universal. It's also can be called a general epistle.
Yeah, I did get the sense as I was reading through this that it was very similar to what we find in the Old Testament in terms of the wisdom literature, right? We already said Proverbs, we've got Ecclesiastes and Sirach, and there's definitely, sort of allusions to that stuff, especially Ecclesiastes that I find here, and we'll get into those verses. And they're good. They're really interesting allusions as well.
Indeed, yes, indeed. We'll bring those out. Well, I think that brings us to the text.
Okay, so let's touch on some of the verses here and some of the sayings of James, so to speak, right? Now, right off in the beginning of this, verse 1, the author says that he's writing to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. Now, this could be a literal communication to Jews who are in, scattered around the diaspora, as it were. Or this could be something more figurative, right? Talking to those who have wandered from the truth, right? Or scattered out and wandered away from the truth. This sort of comes up in a later verse where there is a discussion about those who have wandered away from the truth. And so, again, this could be either speaking literally to a people who are physically spread out among the world and in all the world, or it could be talking to those who are maybe spiritually dispersed, right?
Yeah, it could also be an interpolation, right? This is the letter opening that, again, it's easy to add something to the beginning or the end. It's not the only way to make an interpolation, but yes, it is. It could be an interpolation, so that really this is just a collection of sayings, but now we're going to say, oh, this collection of sayings is intended for this audience, which isn't a particular audience, making it Catholic, but it is a particular audience in some sense, the way you've described it as to the Jews, right? But not at a particular community, but rather a scattering of Jews wherever they are.
Now, one of the questions that came up, Christopher, as we were discussing this letter was how James, the author here, views faith versus how Paul views faith. And one of the things that I said I would do after we talked was go back and read it again with the question in my mind, how does the author of this think about faith? Do they think about faith more as a set of beliefs or more as just trust in God?
And this is important, Ben, because
it is important. Yeah.
Because we saw in the undisputed letters of Paul that faith is about a relationship, right? In fact, it's better translated faithfulness, right? A relationship with God through Christ, right? Whereas for the pseudo-Paul, it's about correct belief. For Hebrews, it's about correct belief. And so what did you come up with? By the way, you're being a great example of how to do this, right? How to study the scriptures.
Well, as I reread it, I did come back with the view that this author is more interested in faith as a trust relationship with God.
Okay. What about works?
Yeah. Now, there are a couple verses where the author gets into the discussion about faith and works, and he brings up the demons or the devils, right? And it says they believe. Now, we can talk about that here in a bit when we get to chapter 2, because I think that he's approaching that a little differently, and that's why he uses the word believe as opposed to faith. And so re-listening to it is what I did. I listened to the King James and looking back at the text and some of the Greek, it really does appear to me that this author's primary concern with the concept of faith has to do with a trust relationship. His concept of faith does seem to be more in line with the way that I would say that the genuine Paul approaches it.
And that may be, but again, I'm not sure. And I think, it's a really good idea. Again, you've been a good example, right? To approach this text with the question, how does this author see faith and works? And how does that differ from, at least, I don't want to say Paul and lump in pseudo-Pauline epistles, right? The undisputed letters of Paul, right? So Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon.
Right.
The 7 undisputed letters of Paul have a way. And by the way, that's another activity, right? Another way to approach the text of the New Testament, which is to say, if these are the undisputed letters of Paul, let's look at these together and see if we can get a sense of what Paul is saying. And then compare those to pseudo-Paul. Compare that to Hebrews. Compare that to James. This is a critical reading, right? That does this kind of comparison. And it can be productive. It has been for me. I feel like I've gotten to understand Paul better. You and I were poking fun at the Paul of Acts. I mean, maybe we can say the Paul of Acts is a caricature in that sense, right? He certainly shows up as a caricature when he's going into synagogues and arguing with people.
Yeah.
Right? And thinking that that's going to convert them. That's where we poke the most fun, right?
Now, the first mention of faith here in James starts with verse 3. It says, "Because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing." Now, this did, for me, come across as not a set of beliefs faith, right? Because you don't test a set of beliefs, but that trials test your trust, right? They test your relationship with God. And so this first use of faith here does seem to me very much like a view that someone is having to trust in God, and their trials are testing that, right? And they are making them have more patience because they are sticking with their faithfulness in God. The word that stands out to me a lot here, though, is endurance. And there was a definition that we looked up for the word endure, and it came out in the context of Doctrine and Covenants because we used the Webster's 1828 dictionary for this word. But in any case, it remains consistent pretty well throughout the history of the use of the word. And the definition here was to bear or suffer without resistance or without yielding. I like this way of using the word endure in the context of a faithful relationship, but also in the context of our nonviolent hermeneutic that we've been using. That enduring something, right, isn't a way of resisting it, isn't a way of fighting back, but it's also not a way of giving in, right? It's something else. It's a different way.
I thought that was a contradiction, without yielding and without resisting.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're resolving that in your mind. Tell me how you do that.
It is, because you're standing firm in terms of you're not pushing back, but you're also not letting it push you, right? You're just staying in place, right? You're just not giving ground, but you're also not pushing back against it.
Now I see. That's very much like Thoreau, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah. And so it's a powerful word to me to think of it in that way, and then to use it within this context of how we approach difficulties of life, trials, and how that informs our faithful relationship with God.
I love it. Ultimately, where this can land you, if you really are not giving in, but you're also not fighting back, you may have to die. And that's what happened with Jesus. That's what happened with Gandhi. That's what happened with Martin Luther King Jr. And it could happen to you if you're faithful.
This brings in concepts we talked about when we covered the Book of Mormon on this topic. We talked about the covenant that the people of Alma make at the Waters of Mormon. They make covenant to stand as a witness of God at all times, in all places, even unto death.
That's right.
And then we talked about this statement that comes up in the war chapters in Alma that is often interpreted as an imperative to go and violently defend yourself and your family, but that could be taken in a much different way when we put it in the context of an understanding both of endurance and also of the covenant that the people of Alma make, which is that we defend our families even unto death. Well, we're not talking about even unto killing. we're not talking about even unto the shedding of blood of someone else. It says, defend your families even unto the shedding of blood. Whose shedding of blood? Well, maybe it's not someone else's. Maybe it's our own, right?
Well, yes, I was thinking, who are the ultimate example of this kind of endurance, right? This kind of standing, or rather kneeling in the case of the Anti-Nephi, the Ahi's, and being willing to die.
Yeah.
They are, right? And by the way, for those who think that this doesn't defend their families, remember that they went out to the field of battle to face their enemies. They didn't stay home and cower. And this is, if I want to make a distinction between being a pacifist and being a nonviolent activist, which may not be fair, right? But I could try to make that distinction. I would say maybe a pacifist stays home and does nothing. These men were non-violently going out to the field of battle to meet the enemy, not to kill, but to be killed. They knelt before the enemy, as we're taught in Alma, and they died and protected their families, because before the enemy came to the doors of their homes, where they would rape and kill their wives and daughters, right? They actually were converted. And more, this is the lowest body count of all battles. And the book is full of battles. The Book of Mormon is full of battles. Lowest body count and highest conversion rate of any battle. And to me, the central teaching of the book, aside from, of course, the teachings of the Savior, which we already have in the Bible, which are repeated in the Book of Mormon.
It really says something. And, I know we've gotten off on a tangent here, but I think it's a very powerful presentation of the narrative, because there's this motif in the Book of Mormon where the antagonist, maybe we get Amalickiah, who says he's going to drink the blood of his enemies, right? And so we have this approach that is always very violent and retaliatory. And yet, what happens when Jesus comes? How does he treat his enemies, right? It's not their blood that he's drinking. It's his blood that he offers us on behalf of our enemies. I mean, that's different, right? That is a complete swap of the narrative. And it invites us to turn that upside down as well.
Indeed, it is.
So we're coming to verse 5 of chapter 1 of James, Christopher, and this is very often quoted within our religious tradition because it finds itself in the narrative of Joseph Smith when he is searching for understanding and what he's supposed to do. And in the Joseph Smith history, we get him saying that he read this verse and pondered on it over and over again, trying to figure out what he was supposed to do. One of the common themes that's coming up throughout this letter is the contrast between rich and poor, right? So one of James' main concerns here is that the poor are to be exalted and the rich made low. And this is a theme in the Gospels as well of Jesus. He's preaching to the poor most often. And in Matthew, we get the beatitude, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, we get that in spirit that Matthew has. When we go to Luke and we get the same beatitude, he doesn't say in spirit, he just says, blessed are the poor. And this sort of portrayed for Luke a more present concern with the economic condition of the people, and Matthew a more present concern with the spiritual condition of the people. But the theme, the concept is the same there, right? And so with James, we get a concern for the poor, for those who are disadvantaged, those who are put upon in society. And this is very much a theme that we find in the sayings in the gospel of Jesus. And I see that, really brought out here as a main point that James is trying to make.
That's right. And these two views are very much related, or can be. They don't have to be, but they can be, right? Mm-hmm. So you don't have to be poor to be poor in spirit, and vice versa, but they often show up together. And that's why, again, this is an ethical discourse. You see here, this is an ethical discourse. And in fact, this is what Nietzsche called slave morality, right? And Nietzsche was very much against this kind of morality, which he saw not only in the Bible, but also going all the way back to Socrates, right? But there is something to this idea, right? That you would be poor in spirit if you were poor in terms of material resources, or that it could lead to that, right? It doesn't have to. And you don't have to be poor in material resources to be poor in spirit. But it's something to think about.
Right. And, we get from the Gospels that comparison there that, Jesus says that it's impossible or difficult, right, for a man to enter into the kingdom of heaven, for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, right? And the idea here is that our riches can become our God, right? And we have to divest ourselves of those things. And so
Indeed.
The poor are those who are more likely to be close to God because they aren't caught up in all of the richness of the world, right? They're more concerned with those things. So
Indeed. And yet, that's not the only thing that can stand in our way, right? As a matter of fact,
right.
Our very idea of God, or what in Sufism we call our God ideal, can stand in our way, because even that can be an idol. As I've said before, even the temple can become an idol, right? These have their place. By the way, the God ideal is I think most troubling, right? Because it can be that your God ideal can get in the way of you knowing the true and living God. Because if the true and living God were to show up, even if he were to walk next to you, I'm referring now to Jesus in the Gospels, right? You might not recognize him because, well, that can't be God. That doesn't match up with my God ideal. My God ideal in that story says God is dead, or Jesus is dead, right? So he can't be here. Well, Jesus is there. Now, what does that mean? That's the whole story, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Or in that story, their expectation was that the Messiah wasn't going to die. He was going to conquer. And
That's
so
right.
he couldn't have, they thought he was going to be the Messiah, but it turns out he wasn't the Messiah. And they're upset about that. Right?
Yeah. So that's the first reason he can't be the Messiah. And then I'm saying, in equating him with God, right? That's what we've done in Christianity in some senses, to equate Jesus with God as part of a Godhead where they're one, right? And of course, to become one with God is an ideal. But again, what does that actually mean? It means something different for Latter-day Saints, generally speaking, than it does from Catholics, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And yet it also means something entirely different to me. And if you want to know what I'm saying, well, maybe listen to Latter-day Contemplation Presents Come Follow Me.
I definitely see these as different facets, but the one that is particularly, meaningful for me is some of the understanding that you and David have been bringing out. So I definitely will endorse that people listen to that and ponder it. You ask, what does it mean? We've said, but I submit that it's not something that can be expressed in words, what that means.
That's right.
It's something that someone has to come to an understanding, a revelation. It has to be revealed. God has to be revealed to that person individually, and that's how they understand what that means.
And that's an experience, and it's an experience of the living God. It's not dead letter, which kills, Paul tells us, right? But it's the living God. It's the Word of God that is written on our hearts, right? It's not dead letter. It's something living. It's something that's part of our experience. It's something that happens to us in the silent chambers of our souls, and which is ineffable. We can try to put it into words, and we do. We want to share our experience. But the best we can hope for is that somehow the listener has an experience of her own, and that somehow comes through.
In verse 12, Christopher, we get the use of the word endures again. So it says, blessed is anyone who endures temptation. And I just love this concept here.
Yes.
This brings it out again.
Not resisting and not yielding.
Not resisting and not yielding. Exactly. And I think this has been a life-changing perspective change for me. To look at temptation as not just something to not yield to. Right? We often think that, and I know the scriptures put it this way, and we even have statements about this, but I really love the use and the concept that comes through the word endure more than resist. Because what happens so much is when I find that if I try to resist temptation, as in fight against it, right, then it's something that becomes this struggle, and it pushes back even more, right? Temptation pushes back even more if I try to resist against it. Now, I'm certainly not willing to yield, but I like the word endure, because what it means is that I sit there, I stay where I stay in place, right? I don't push against it and I don't yield to it. And what am I doing when I'm sitting there? I'm trying to understand.
It's self-examination.
I'm sitting in silence, trying to understand, where is this coming from? Why am I feeling this way? And analyzing that, right? So that I can deal with what's really going on, not just the surface inclination or impulse of temptation, but what is really going on? Where is this really coming from? What does this really mean about myself? And in fact, later in here in this letter, it talks about temptations and talks about where they come from our desires, and if we let them, build within us. And I don't know that it speaks about it perfectly and consistently with the way that I'm trying to present, but I think that it does let us approach temptation not necessarily as something that is always 100%, coming from the devil, right? But as something that is coming from a place inside of us that is growing out of a need that we have. And how do we address that need rather than just pushing it away, right?
I think you're absolutely right. It's self-examination. And when I say self-examination, I mean this is soul work, right? English has a separate word for soul and self. Hebrew doesn't. It's nephesh. Arabic doesn't. It's nafs. They're cognate, right? It's examining your own soul, and you can't resist it. You can't push it away. Right? You can't just resist it. You can't push it away because it's a part of yourself. It's a part of your soul. It comes from your own desires. So the question is, can you inquire into those desires, as you've put it, Ben? And you said analyze. I get why you say that. I think from a Sufi perspective, it's not analysis because that goes to the head, right? And
okay.
I know I've found that my master has taught me, that I'm asking my head questions that only my soul can answer. And so it's really a matter of introspection, of going into your own soul. And as you've pointed out, Ben, in a previous episode, anything that we push outside of ourselves, right? If I'm saying, I don't want this to be a part of me when it is, right? If I'm going to push it out, then as something now exterior, it can take us over from the outside, right? This is something that has to be integrated, to use Carl Jung's language. Again, whether there's a devil out there, I don't know, and I don't really care because it's not something that I deal with. If I have to deal with it, I'll deal with it. But right now, what I'm dealing with is the devil inside. And the devil inside is a part of me. So I can't push it away. I can't reject it. I can't, somehow get rid of it. It's something that I have to figure out how to deal with and how to live with. And, to borrow again from Elizabeth Gilbert, I think from her TED Talk, somewhere I heard her say that, like, fear is another way to think of this, right? That's something that maybe it has to come along with us, right? It can come along on the car trip, let's say, but it doesn't get to change the radio. It doesn't even get to sit shotgun, right? It's like we can't deny any part of ourselves, any part of our souls, but we have to put them all in their proper place. We have to order our souls.
Yeah, so this next verse, that verse 13, it says, one is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it, right? And so this is something, like you said, that's part of ourselves. And so we need to listen without resisting and without yielding, right? That endure type of thing. That's a good way, I think, to consider an approach to temptation.
And the very next verse tells us, as you said, that, well, I guess two verses later, verse 14, one is tempted by one's own desire, right? It's not coming from God. It's coming from one's own desire. And the text tells us it's not from God. I would say it's not even from anywhere else, right? It's from our own desires. I'm reminded of a saying from Oscar Wilde, who's thought of as a rascal and may be a rascal, but I still think what he's saying is true. He says the only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it, meaning it's not going to go away. I think what he's saying is consistent with what the Book of Mormon tells us, that without quoting a verse, I remember reading in the Book of Mormon that temptation is something that, to put it in a paraphrase, is there 24/7, 365. It's not going to go away. So it's not about getting rid of it. And it's not about yielding to it either, as Oscar Wilde says necessarily, right? But it's about integrating it. It's about not yielding, not resisting, but enduring.
Yeah. Now, verse 20, we get a discussion about anger here, and it brings up a sort of a tangential point that I think is even more interesting for me. But verse 20, it says, your anger does not produce God's righteousness. Okay, so let's chew on that for a little bit. Often I hear people talk about how there's righteous anger, and that's the kind of anger that's okay, right? Righteous indignation or whatever, right? And obviously we get examples in the scriptures over and over of it saying God's anger and here and there. This does seem to contradict that view, right? That there's somehow something that is righteous anger because it says your anger does not produce God's righteousness. I think that often throughout history, there have been atrocities committed in anger and done in the name of God, as if they were somehow accomplishing God's righteousness, right?
Well, that's easy, right, to think, right? And of course, anyone who kills is going to say they're doing it in the name of God, and they're going to feel better about themselves, right? You and I both studied Middle East studies, right, in college. Mm-hmm. We know that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not about religion. We even know that the Crusades were not about religion. But of course, people killing people are going to say they're doing it in the name of God. And they're going to feel better about themselves. And by the way, we're going to have to deal with this in January when we come to Nephi killing Laban. Mm-hmm. And we'll cross that bridge when we find it, just like we've got Revelation coming up, right? Just looking ahead.
Yeah. I like how the verse finishes here, though. It says, welcome with meekness the implanted word that has the power to save your souls. I think there's a ton in this phrase. There's a ton going on in this phrase. But the thing that really stood out to me is this implanted word, right? It's almost like this seed. And we get the idea of this in Alma chapter 32, where he talks about the word being planted, right? And growing up into a tree. And so that's what it made me think of, is the word being implanted in our souls and growing into a tree. What tree? The tree of life. That is a wisdom tree. Or to me, this is a reference to the divine feminine that we accept into our souls, right? And then it bears fruit. What's the fruit? The love of God, the wisdom that we gain from accepting it.
Something else that can be said about this verse is this is actually a difference between Paul and James, right? Because Paul understands the word to refer to Jesus, right? Heart is about belief, right? So here James is going to say, by this implanted word, that it's God's natural moral law described by the scripture, right? As in the mouth and heart. And this is something, this law has to be observed. So that's where I see James saying something more like it's about believing the right things, right? And doing the right things than for Paul.
Yeah, I saw that not as and it definitely could be the author's intention, but what I got out of it was something more mystical, right? Mm-hmm. than maybe what the author's intent was. Verse 27, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to care for orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained from the world.
So it's not about judging your neighbor.
Yeah, right.
It's not even about, pious performances other than, of course, meaning ritual, right? It's not about ritual. It's not even about attendance, right? It's not about reading your scriptures. It's not about praying. Do you see what I'm saying, Ben? It's about caring for the orphans and widows. And these are the same teachings that we get from other great religious leaders.
Yeah. Well, and I would say those rituals, those prayers, those reading your scriptures, what they are about is this.
They're a container.
Yeah. Their purpose is to ultimately point us to this. He's saying that the essence, right, the pure, undefiled religion for God is this. And any of those other things are to be pointing us to this, loving God and loving our neighbor. And here we have this particular formulation of this because it's talking about caring for orphans and widows. remember within the cultural context, and this isn't just Roman, this also happens within Jewish culture, in this patriarchal view of things, right? Anyone who doesn't have a male provider as part of the family, right, is someone that requires our extra care and attention, right? Because they are liable to be forgotten by society at large otherwise, because they don't have someone representing them within the public sphere, right? Someone who's providing for them or dealing with the public for them. And so orphans who don't have a father, or widows widows isn't just someone, a woman whose husband has died. Remember, widows in the context is anyone who doesn't have an adult male member of the family to care for them. So that could be a woman who doesn't have any adult male children or something like that, right? And again, this is positing the responsibility of the Christian community to care for the people who are most disadvantaged in society. And this goes to the overall theme that James has about the poor being those who we focus on.
Amen and amen. And by the way, he gets right into this in chapter 2 at the very beginning, that it's this idea that God is no respecter of persons, because he's saying, oh, you like, to focus on the people who have, gold rings and fine clothes coming into your assembly. And if a poor person in dirty clothes also comes in, if you take notice of the one wearing the fine clothes and say, have a seat here, please, while to the one who is poor, you say, stand there or sit at my feet, right? This is, in that context, it looks different from our context, but I think we can easily see how we do this. We do some version of this in our context. And sometimes we do it wittingly, sometimes we do it unwittingly, right? The question is, where is our heart? Who would notice this in a judgmental way, and who would notice this in let me reach out way, right? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And by the way, I can't not say this, Ben. In my stake, this is, I think, sort of an extreme, ugly example. When I think of, going back to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think of, you and I have both seen the wall, right? The wall that has been built that separates Palestinians from Israelis. And it is something so ugly on so many levels of meaning, right? Physically, spiritually, and some degrees in between in some sense, right? I think, in my stake, because there's a problem of, is it my stake? It's here in town, put it that way. It's not my stake. It's another stake in my town. It's on the wrong side of town, so to speak, right? So although we have, in where I live, we have a homeless problem, right? And so this problem, what do you mean by problem? Is this a problem we need to solve, or is this a problem we need to deal with? And so what's happened is that there has been a fence built around the stake center because we don't want homeless people coming to our church. Now, this is complicated, right? It's a complex problem. But there's a sense in which we can say, hear what I'm saying. Well, we don't want homeless people coming to our church. I mean, isn't church where homeless people come for relief? That's the challenge. That's something to think about.
Yeah. I think, as with a lot of things, the act itself isn't necessarily the issue, but what's the motivation behind it, right? Like, what's the true feeling behind the building of the fence?
Right.
Is it just to keep them out, or is there something else going on? And are we willing to address the problem in other ways? Or is this the solution, right? Well, just build a fence and that fixes it, right?
Right.
Or are we really considering that there's something else going on here that we need to deal with? And I think that at its core principle, this is related to that concept of the temptation, right? Because we seem to just be pushing back against this, resisting it, rather than saying, okay, what's going on? How are we actually addressing this issue, right? And really dealing with it, as opposed to just fighting against it, right?
Right. It's a complex matter again. So I'll give two sort of counter examples. One from church, one from Starbucks. Starbucks has a policy that everyone is welcome. Apparently, we don't have that policy. We say we have that policy, but homeless people can come into Starbucks. I remember sitting at Starbucks, using Wi-Fi, being there in the summer here in Bakersfield where it's really hot. It's 105 degrees every day, sometimes higher, 110, 15. And a homeless person walked in, and they're welcome to come in. And it's actually a problem for Starbucks. They have made it so that the sink is outside the bathroom because homeless people are coming in and bathing in the sink. They've had employees who have been tamping down trash with their hands and been stabbed by, hypodermic needles used by homeless people in the restroom using heroin, right? So now they use something made out of metal to tamp down the trash, but they still allow everyone to come in. So they've had to deal with this. And I don't know that this is the best way. And again, it just points to the complexity of the problem.
Yeah.
But I remember smelling this person from 3 tables away. And this person came in and just wanted to put down their head and take a nap in the air conditioning. And I thought, you know what? I've got Wi-Fi at home. And I just went home. I remember thinking to pay for whatever drink this person might want to have when they woke up, and I didn't do it. And you see, that was one of those moments, where that was the right thing to do, and I didn't do it. Another example, counterexample, maybe not as extreme. I think those two were sort of black and white, night and day. But I remember when there was a hurricane in Louisiana, Slidell, Louisiana. I was living in Houston at the time. My elders quorum organized to go down for the weekend, and we were told, they had been wiped out in Slidell. We were told that we had to bring everything we would need with us, that we couldn't count on finding anything we needed there. We even brought gasoline to get us back home. Not just the gasoline in the tank, but outside of the tank to add to the tank. Everything we needed to eat, everything we needed, period. And we went and spent the weekend, and the steak center, instead of having a fence around it. Now, again, it's not the kind of extreme example I gave with Starbucks, because it's not that the steak center became a place for people who were displaced from their homes, which really wasn't the issue. It was more like there were trees falling on their homes and in their yards and things like this, right? And that they didn't have what they needed. So they also didn't come asking for anything. But it did become this place where all of us who were there to serve could sleep. There were tents everywhere around the steak center, and there were people sleeping inside. And by the way, if there were people who weren't there to help, who were, from the neighborhood sleeping inside, I'm not aware. That's possible. All we did, other than sleep there and eat there and shower there, I think in the parking lot, not in the sink, was to have sacrament, by which I mean sing a hymn, say a prayer, bless the sacrament, pass it, and get back to work.
Yeah.
And we went out and served.
Yeah, we did a similar thing when we did the cleanup of the tornado in Joplin about 12 years ago. Of course, the stake center, the church there was completely leveled. And so there wasn't anywhere for us to gather. We went to someone's warehouse instead. But yes, I do know that in those situations, they open up the church buildings to be used either as a base of operations or to house people who are displaced from their homes. So that can all be arranged, and stake presidents have the leeway to do that. So,
and where I live, there's also, we don't have, in California, there are no bishop storehouses. So what happens is, I think it's once a month, the stake center becomes a makeshift bishop storehouse. So yeah. I've gone with my family to volunteer. A semi comes in, at least one semi, maybe more than one. And everything that's needed comes out of the semi into the stake center and is set up. And that's what we're there to do, is to set this all up and to distribute to those in need who come. But again, this is not, homeless people can't walk in off the street and avail themselves of this support, right? This is, and again, there's order to the church. I get that. But the question is, how can we do more? And again, that has to be up to us. And we don't have to wait for the church to answer this question for us. It's, what can I do?
Right. There's organizations. I mean, people can do it at an individual level. And I think that is important. I think it's also important that they get involved in some organization that is doing it in a systematic way. I think both are important because I think you need the personal contact with people and your personal guidance. And then I also think, working in some sort of organized institutional way is also a benefit because you can see the greater amount of good, for lack of a better term, right? But the greater efficiency that's gained from doing it that way. And it's not just about efficiency, right? So I think, both things are important.
Well, we need a face too, right? A personal touch.
Yeah, exactly. At least here in my city and anywhere, there are organizations like this, right? That either the church endorses or directly contributes to help them accomplish their mission. And so often in places, rather than being redundant on those services, the church will either donate money. Well, they almost always will donate money, but then the local members will also donate time to that local organization to contribute to helping the homeless or just anybody in the community in need. So
again, it's a complex problem. And
yeah, it is.
And there are pros and cons, by the way, to the more organized efforts, because again, you don't have that personal touch, right? And then there can be levels of bureaucracy that eat up donation money in some sense, right? So sometimes, I think at all times actually, if you feel called to act in an individual, personal way, do it. Don't do as I did. Do it. Right? Offer to buy that drink or that meal or whatever you feel called to do. Listen to your heart. Listen for divine guidance and act on it. Right? There's that. And then, working together. There are other ways to work together. You've pointed out volunteering. You've pointed out organizations working together. I like to tell the story. I'm glad you shared, what our church is doing. I'm going to share what the Catholic Church is doing because Catholic Relief Services is settling refugees in, Salt Lake. And they have been for decades. I remember when Syrian refugees were coming and Americans, including Christians, including our co-religionists, Ben, were rejecting and pushing back against that and thinking that somehow this was something new that refugees were coming when this is something that's been happening for decades. And I like to point out that the man in charge of settling those refugees works for Catholic Relief Services and is a Muslim. This is one of those, a Jew, a priest and a rabbi, and an imam walk into a bar story,
Yeah.
I mean, this is what's going on in Salt Lake. So find out what's going on where you live and get involved. Just Serve might be a way to get involved. This is one of the organized ways to get involved, but also, again, listen to your heart, listen for divine guidance and act on it.
And as you're talking about that, Christopher, I'm realizing that this is what it comes across to me is what James means by works.
Yes.
What he means is good works or good deeds. James isn't talking about, at least in this context, he's not talking about works being getting circumcised or not eating certain things or doing the ritualistic things, the requirements of the law. James is talking about good works or good deeds being, in particular, caring for the poor.
And that
is his main focus here.
And this is where he is in agreement with Paul.
Yeah.
Although, okay, so I don't think, so Paul is speaking against works of the law. Mm-hmm. He's not speaking necessarily for these kind of works, but he's also not against them. So in some sense, we can say they're in agreement, even though they're talking about different things. Yeah,
I mean, there are definitely points in Paul where we can see that he does intend that things are done out of love, right?
Yes.
So things operating in this manner. And
well,
so I think
love is all there is for Paul in the end, right? I mean, in the end, right? Go read 1 Corinthians 13. In the end, all you need is love. All there is love. The only reality is love. God is love.
Yeah. So for James, it's okay, you believe, you trust God, or you believe these certain things, however you want to posit that the faith is, or you say you have love, let's see it, right? Let's see it. The good works, those are the demonstration of that. So for James, it becomes, to me, more practical, right? He wants you actually acting it out.
And this is what verses 8 through all the way through 20 are about.
Yeah,
I don't
26.
think we need to say anything more
to the
about
end of the
them,
chapter
right?
2.
All the way through the end of the chapter.
Yeah.
Faith without works is dead, he says. But he doesn't mean the works of the law like Paul.
Right, and I think that's an important distinction here, is that we can confound this and see that maybe they're using this word works and think they're talking about the same thing, and they're not. Now, the only thing here from chapter 3 was just another point about wisdom. So verse 17, he says, wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace. Now, there's a possible translation flop here, and that is that the word that's translated as for, when he says peace for those who make peace, it could be by. And I think that's a fascinating translation. So if we get by, we get, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace.
Amen. Here's what I heard, Ben. Peace, 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 peaceable, gentle, yielding, merciful. Amen and amen. And if there's not peace, if there's conflict, let's look at chapter 4, verse 1. Where does that come from? As mentioned earlier, do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. This is the essence of René Girard's theory of mimetic desire and mimetic violence. I would refer the listener to Latter-day Contemplation, to our latest episode on René Girard, and ask you to look forward to our upcoming interview with Max Sterling on the same subject. Max Sterling is someone who has written about Girard, who has met Girard, talked with him. It's desire. It's our desires that produce the conflicts between us.
It's interesting here that he says that, those outward conflicts, like you were saying, Christopher, come from the conflict within, right?
In the soul.
Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you, right? So if we look first to our own souls and we find peace there, and then we're able to reflect that out into the world. How many people maybe say they want peace or are going out to have peace, but if they don't have peace within themselves, they're going to get in a situation where, they're pushed to the limit, right? And they don't have their own souls ordered. How are they then to order the world, right?
God bless my wife. He has blessed me with her. This is what she's telling me. Right? Here I am podcasting on peace. She's telling me, well, I know this is something I'm working on with David, with my Sufi master. And it's creating that peace within me, right? That's what spiritual practices are about. And where they lead is peace, service, all of this, what we're looking at here in James, right? This is really good stuff. So going to verse 11, he tells us, just like earlier we said, what is religion about, right? Pure and undefiled religion. And I said it wasn't about judging. Well, here it is. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers and sisters. Whoever speaks evil against another or judges another speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge. There's one lawgiver and judge who is able to save and to destroy. So who then are you to judge your neighbor? Who am I to judge my neighbor?
Now, in these next verses, there is a statement here that was, for me, an allusion to Ecclesiastes. So verse 14, for you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes.
Yes, indeed. I can hear the spray bottle on An Introduction to Joy by Rob Bell on YouTube. Yeah. Check it out if you haven't. So I know you have, Ben. So yeah, this may not be so obvious, right? If you're reading from King James, because what does it tell us in Ecclesiastes and King James? Isn't it vanity is the word?
Yeah, vanity.
And Rob Bell uses the word, what is the word he uses?
Mist, I think, or vapor,
Right,
yeah.
Mist, vapor, right? It's all mist and vapor. So here it is, mist. It appears, then it vanishes. It's something fleeting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And by the way, and Ecclesiastes tells us, therefore, right? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And we think, a puritanical American Christian sees that and says, oh, that's of the devil, right? This idea of eat, drink, and be merry. No, Rob Bell is telling us. No, Ecclesiastes is telling us. And this is what he's saying. No, that's not what we're saying here. What we're saying is eat, drink, be merry, for tomorrow we die. Life is short. Enjoy it. This is not a license. Come on. James is speaking against anyone who thought what Paul said meant I can just throw out the law and do whatever I want. Yes, Paul is saying set aside Torah in some sense, at least to Gentiles, right? And to Jews, he's saying that's not what it's all about. It never was. It's not what's going to do it for you, right? No amount of doing stuff by Torah, right? Of eat this, don't eat that, is going to, I think you would agree with James on what we should do. And yet, why do we do these things? It's because life is so precarious. That's the whole point of ethics, is life is precarious. That's the beginning of the conversation. Life is precarious. It needs to be sustained in ourselves and in others, which is what this is about. And by the way, what is sin? Here it is. I'm convicted. I didn't buy the drink or the meal. Anyone then who knows the right thing to do, did I know the right thing to do in the moment? Yes, I did, and fails to do it, commits sin. That's my sin. I've repented. I'm sharing it with you. I'm sharing my lesson with you, right? What I learned from that experience. And I'm reminding myself so that next time I know the right thing to do, I don't fail to do it. I don't commit sin.
Christopher, we said that for Paul, sin was a denial or refusal to acknowledge grace.
Yes, the grace that I was to offer that has been offered to me already.
Isn't that interesting how that fits with this concept, right? That we know the right thing to do, right? We have an understanding of grace. It's been offered us, and we don't pay it forward.
And all we can do, and this is our only freedom, to quote my Sufi master, quoting, yes, our freedom is the part we offer. I remember reading, is it in this book, something about liberty?
Yes. The Perfect Law of Liberty.
That's right. Yeah. That's how I'm reading that. I'm not reading it in my old libertarian way of reading it. I'm reading it in my Christian way of reading it. And quoting my Sufi master, quoting, yes.
Chapter 5 continues with the theme of rich and poor, right? And exalting the poor and abasing the rich. There is a discussion here of those who oppress the laborers in their wages. Again, being concerned with the plight of the vulnerable. He says in verse 6, you have condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not resist you. Okay, so here we have this not resisting thing again. So this could be, maybe a literal allusion to Jesus, the righteous one, right? But there's also could be figuratively talking about the treatment of the poor, those who are righteous among us, but we condemn them or murder them, so to speak, right? Because they don't have any power. And this reminds me of the statement by Jesus, blessed are the little ones, or blessed are the children who come unto me, right? And the idea is, how do we treat those who can't offer us anything, right? Jesus says that those who accept a child accept the kingdom of heaven, or accept a child as they would accept the kingdom of heaven. And the idea here is that how is it that we treat those people in society who can't offer us anything? And that's children, or that's the vulnerable, the poor, right? They can't give us anything in return. How do we treat them?
And here's the answer. How does God treat us who can't give him anything in return but what he has given us?
Bingo.
Pass it on.
Yeah.
Pay it forward. That's all we can do. With gratitude in our hearts, acknowledging grace, lest we sin.
In verse 8, there's this statement about the coming of the Lord being near, right? I know you mentioned this, Christopher, but again, this can mean a lot of things in the context. Here, it could be either an interpolation, or we can take it in a symbolic sense, right? That when Jesus says, "You have done it unto the one of the least of these, you have done it unto me," in this context, when it's the poor we're supposed to be reaching out to and caring for, right? The coming of the Lord is always near.
Yes.
Because the poor are always there among us.
This is the third reference to Jesus, although this one doesn't have to be a reference to Jesus. So it doesn't have to be an interpolation because it can be referring to the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is something that's already present in the Jewish tradition. It's in the Tanakh, right? It's in what we call the Old Testament. Yeah. But yes, the coming of the Lord is something, again, thinking of Yogananda and the second coming of Christ within you, right? Not some external event, not a one-time event, but something that can happen to all of us, and something that we can have glimpses of that can happen again and again, something that I'm looking forward to, and that I have to strengthen my heart, meaning I have to do this soul work, right? I have to get out of my head and into my heart to be able to welcome that second coming, that day of the Lord, that coming of the Lord, as something that's an internal event, something that as a mystic I'm looking for, not out there, but in here. The kingdom of God is within you, said Jesus. That's where I'm looking for this to happen.
But in a sense, there is a sense in which it could be out there. And this is sort of formulated by the hymn we have, "A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief," right? Where the Lord is the one who is on the side of the road that needs our help.
That's right. I was going to say the same thing. Yeah. If it's out there, it's because God is no respecter of persons, and it's because ye are gods. Isn't that what Jesus said? Ye are gods. When we serve our fellow man, we serve God, because our fellow man is God, is our fellow man.
Now, the last thing I think I want to point out here is an allusion to the endurance of Job, or the patience of Job, as it were, in verse 11, right? Now, again, there's the use of the word endurance here. And I really like the use of that term as applied to the story of Job, right? Because all of these things that are happening to Job, right? He's not yielding to them, as in he's not saying, I accept that I did something wrong, but he's also not like fighting against them in terms of, what do they tell him? They tell him to curse God and die, right? But he insists, right? He endures. He insists, I need my day in court with God, so to speak. I need God to come and explain this to me, what's going on.
Well, it's interesting because there's a sense in which we could look at him and think he's resisting, right? He doesn't curse God and die, as it were, but he's not actually, he is pushing back in some sense, right? So, but here's the thing. Ultimately, when he's doing this, right, when he's complaining to the Lord, he's complaining to the Lord, right?
Yes.
He's actually in relationship with the Lord throughout it all. And that's the way in which he's not resisting.
Yes.
Even though he's not yielding.
He stays in that relationship. In that relationship, right? This is the concept of the faith, right? No matter what, you stay in the relationship, the faithfulness, the trust, the loyalty.
There's something else that we didn't talk about when we talked about Job that I want to bring up here. Ben, you sent me what was really intended to be a joke, but jokes, they have truth to them, right? And so someone was pointing out that everything was taken from Job, right? Where his
Oh, yes.
his family, well, I say his family, it's his children, right? His possessions, and then his very, self, or his very body at least, is, somehow under attack. But his wife wasn't taken from him. And this is supposed to be a joke. And somebody says, but Satan, his wife is still there. What about her? And he says, I know, ha, ha, ha. And that's supposed to be a dig against one's wife. But look what a blessing that is to Job. What a blessing my wife has been to me, right? But there's something there to think about. One more tidbit. I mean, Job has so much depth.
Yeah.
We did a lot with our episode on Job. And I would encourage anyone who hasn't listened to it to go back and listen to it, because it's good stuff. I want to go back and listen to it myself. But there's so much more to Job. And that's the beauty of this kind of wisdom literature that is Job, right? Is that it keeps on giving and giving and giving. And it's this endless spring of wisdom.
Yeah. And going along with that, as we've been saying, I really see this book of James as very much in the tradition of wisdom literature.
It is.
And very much informed by it, and very much of the opinion that Jesus, right, that was in that tradition, because Jesus is quoted, so to speak, many times in this. There's many things in here that we find as sayings of Jesus in the Gospels, and there could be many reasons for that, right? But we definitely see the similarity in terms of the approach to the concept of wisdom literature, as it were. So
I would agree. And yet, I distinguish between the Gospels, and especially the Gospel of Thomas, which I first identified with this book when I was reading it, or the book of James, right? But again, very much in line with the teachings of Jesus. And I think that's the point of the author. But
yes.
But it really is more like the Proverbs of the New Testament, because it's not Jesus says, it's I say, right? It's Solomon says, I say, whereas Thomas says, Jesus says. But this is in line with the teachings of Jesus. Well, that's James.
That's James. And there's even more there. I mean, there's more going on in here than we talked about, as always.
That's right. So it's not James, right? But that's our treatment of James for now. We're still talking about Job, so James could come up again.
That's right.
Thank you for listening. And thank you, Ben, for being with me.
Thank you, Christopher. Have a good week, everybody.